Welcome everybody to Virtual Lunch Club on Wednesdays, and we've been hosting these throughout lockdown. So good to see some regulars here. As always, please feel free to comment on the chat. So hi everyone. Hey Laura, good to have you back. So first of all, a quick hair update. As you know, I'm sort of been growing this as a measure of lockdown, and it's getting kind of so heavy on the top that it's sort of fallen back into this sort of slip. Entirely unintended, and occasionally a bit will drop down at the front, a bit like a kind of 80s pop star. So don't know where it's going, but we don't know where lockdown is going. So there you go. So this is an opportunity for us to connect and have a chat with people on the tables, but also hear some topical content on mental health and well-being in the workplace. And we've got a fantastic panel discussion lined up today. I'm really excited about this. We've got some interesting world events going on, both from the Black Lives Matter movement, the coronavirus itself. There's been some legislation that has changed from the UK government on trans rights. And all of these have an impact on our mental health. And what we've also got here are a collection of individuals who are very passionate about the mental health agenda. So in no particular order, I'm going to start inviting our panelists up to our virtual stage. So, and then I'll introduce them when they're all up here. So just bear with me while I do that. Hi, Martika, how are you today?
I am well. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. What's your form score today?
My form score was 7.
Good to see you. It was a pretty encouraging set of form scores, that wasn't it? Like nothing below. I've never seen anything like that before. Nothing below a 7.
You've got some high achievers on your panel.
Well, that's it. We got happy people today. So I'm just going to invite Ro up, and then we've got a full house. So thank you so much for joining us, and finally welcome Ro. So basically, we've got 3 members of the Inside Out leaderboard in Abhijay, Rachel, and Ro, and then we've got a psychologist in Martika, and you also have a mental health business. So could I just ask you briefly to introduce yourselves and just say why the mental health agenda briefly is so important to you? Abhijay, if we could start with you, please.
Sure, happy to. So I'm Abhijay Jain. I am a partner at PwC, and I've also been called a mental health advocate over the last 4 years. So a bit of a campaigner, both inside the firm and actually, Rob, with your support outside as well. Initially focused very much on reducing the stigma by sharing stories, but nowadays focus more on how do we change our culture and the way we approach well-being in a way that is holistic. My journey is sort of comes in 3 parts. There is a personal angle to it. My wife went through a period of anxiety and depression, and actually she was the inspiration behind me taking on the role. There's a cultural side which we can explore during this conversation as well. I'm originally from Nepal, and growing up there and in that culture, mental health was never ever spoken about, and I'm curious about sort of being able to sort of change that. And then there is a business side as well. We are a big employer. We have more than 20,000 people. We frankly make money from people's brains, and it's interesting that until a few years ago, that thought of in that context. And again, I'm in a bit of a mission to try in the corporate world as well. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing, Abhijay. And yeah, definitely keen to get into that language and that cultural difference as we progress in the discussion. And Martika, you're founder of Benevolent Health and a psychotherapist. Tell us kind of your story a little bit and what has drawn you to the mental health world.
Hi everyone, so my name is Martika. As Rob said, I am the founder of Benevolent Health, and really I wanted to bring something different to the table in terms of mental health, because I felt that sometimes the narrative was not completely inclusive. So in everything that we do, we try to think about all the cultural nuances with mental health, try and involve the BAME communities, and also think about how we can use peer support and mentoring to bring mental health to the masses, if you like. Because I think that often in mental health, we focus on it from a crisis end when things have gone wrong. And I think there's a really wide spectrum in the preventative space to do a lot more and be much more proactive.
Fantastic, and thank you. And I'm certainly keen to talk about that prevention and peer support. Actually, I think that they're two important aspects of this discussion. I'm going to come to you next, Ro, because I'm sort of going around a clock as I see everybody here. I did try and get the word benevolent in everybody's job title, but I could only manage it with two of you. So you are the HR and people leader of Benevolent AI and a long-time campaigner around mental health, and have done some fantastic things. But please introduce yourself a little bit to our watchers.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name's Rohan. Actually, I only get called Rohan when I'm in trouble with my mum, so please as Rob addressed me. So yes, I'm the HR director for Benevolent AI. And we work in the drug discovery space, biotechnology using data and AI to discover new medical interventions, particularly for vulnerable patient groups. I've been with the company 3 months. I think in terms of my own background, as Rob said, yes, I have lived experiences, and just listening to Abhijay, there were many things which ran parallel. But for me, I have lived experience which really did take me to a point of almost losing my life with bipolar and suicide. And I've been really fortunate to have multiple platforms to be a voice for change in recent years. Initially through Mind as an ambassador and campaigner, I've been able to work with them from a fundraising perspective, but also with their corporate partnerships. So workspace mental health. Health obviously means a hell of a lot to me, but also then within the workplace, looking at how we actually create better well-being for our people. And I'm really conscious of ensuring that, I think taking what Martika said, let's talk about actually prevention and early conversation rather than waiting till our people are coming to us with clinical complaints. So I've had that platform, and I've had the platform as a marathon runner and fundraiser. So, I just feel really humbled, 15, 16 years on from my most difficult days now, to have a platform as a business leader, Benevolent AI, through Inside Out, through Mind, and through my own endeavors to actually be a voice for change at a time when we need it so badly.
Fantastic, thank you, Ro, and really good to hear that introduction and those perspectives. And again, the word prevention is coming out strongly there, which we'll talk about. So Rachel, you definitely have the best company name of any company I've ever come across. Actually, you are the CEO and founder of Global Butterflies, which I wish I'd have come up with that name for anything that I do. I think it's wonderful. But I've heard your story before, and it's very powerful. But please just give us a snapshot of what drives you, particularly in terms of what you do and the mental health aspects of that.
Sure. Well, my name is Rachel Rees. I'm CEO of Global Butterflies, which is a trans and non-binary inclusion company that trains mainly in the corporate sector. We train in all over the world, but mainly in the UK. The reason I'm passionate, I'm not a mental health expert, but I am I come across it every day with the community that I serve and work with, from people who transition to people who are not out in the workplace, to people, to environmental stress, which we're going to talk a bit about, government legislation, all the things that affect our community day on day. My personal journey with mental health is that, I was a high achiever, operations director, I had a parent with dementia, I was, out trans woman, working 100 hours a week, doing stupid. I woke up in the middle of the night when I was in Ireland and had a panic attack that I just lost control. The GP had to inject me and knock me out. I slept for 24 hours, which was the best sleep I've ever had. And when I woke up from that, I stopped sleeping. And for the last, since 2012, I have to medicate. I have to, have counseling. I have to, I do yoga, meditation, do diet, do exercise. And with me, for mental health, I live with it. I described it as your last event as a tiger that stalks me. It's always there, and providing I look after myself, put gaps, and remember to have fun, and remember to take breaks and do these things I say, it doesn't get close. But I've had two instances. I was in Belfast last year, and I had a meltdown in a hotel room. I was working too hard. I didn't do those things, and it took a swipe. I had a panic attack, couldn't do the things I was there to do. And so it's always there, but I'm always very aware of it. And because in the trans and non-binary space that I work, I come across people who are suffering as well. And working with employers on helping and looking after their trans and non-binary employees has become a big part of my life, not just in the training, but how they take care of their trans and non-binary employees, because it affects me as well. And I really can feel, their angst in the workplace.
Yeah, fantastic, Rachel. Thank you so much for sharing. And again, I'm hearing self-awareness. I'm hearing, an understanding of your drivers that I think we all, as humans that have experienced a challenge or been with somebody that's experienced a challenge as a loved one, start to build up that knowledge of self-awareness. And I think as we talk about prevention, it's about how do we help everybody get that level of self-awareness that we've sort of won in a hard-fought battle with ourselves, really. Layering on top of that, I think I made the point, I think, in some of the notes before this event was mental health does not discriminate. Mental ill health does not discriminate. But yet we do see differences in the level of stigma in different groups, different diverse groups. I guess a question for all of you to get your different perspectives on this. Why do you think that is? And Abhijay, you mentioned the cultural point in your intro. I'll start with you, if I may.
I think, my personal sort of view on this is that cultural side does play a big part, right? As a South Asian male, this is not something I was ever comfortable talking about until a few years ago. Where I grew up, the language doesn't even have the words to describe mental ill health. I've mentioned this to you before. There's language to describe crazy, but there is no language to describe sort of the spectrum of mental ill health. And it's almost like an admission of failure. Why would you need to involve somebody else to help you with what's inside your brain? You should be able to just deal with it yourself. And that sort of prison is a self-built one over time, and that becomes very hard to sort of break out of. I remember trying to sort of come out, if that's the right word, to my parents to say, at that point in time, both Amrutha and I were sort of going through therapy, and the positive side of the whole cultural experience was the amount of support you got on the back of that was amazing. But to have that conversation, that was very, very difficult. So for me, there is a big part of that which I think gets missed in a lot of the mainstream discussion of actually when we start talking about stigma, and I can see some comments already on there. The nuances of the stigma are different in different communities. I think those need to be addressed as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely, and it needs to be smashed. But I think there's different ways to smash it. And Martika, clearly, as a Black woman and a therapist, a trained therapist, and someone who's passionate about this, this is something you're talking about quite a lot. What is your perspective, and why do you think we see those differences in the stigmas in the Black community?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, Abhijay, in terms of communities and how communities view mental health. And I think certainly in my culture, I think there's a challenge around being vulnerable potentially, but also from a kind of systemic perspective. Actually, systemically, I think sometimes being Black or blacks associated with aggression or things that are, you know, are not vulnerable. So I think it's a challenge potentially as a, you know, a collective conscious to really express that voice. I also think there's some challenges around, you know, how we view mental health and mental illness. I think across communities, we see them as the same thing when actually we all have mental health. And I think, you know, for us who are quite informed, that seems like a really basic thing. But it surprises me, you know, when I go to organisations or I talk to people about mental health and they assume it's like schizophrenia or personality disorder, when actually it's about, you know, how are you sleeping? What's your food and nutrition like? You know, all of these things that affect all of us, regardless of colour, culture, background. You know, it's really flipping that conversation into a place of we all have mental health.
Absolutely, and yeah, I could bang the drum all day on this about the need to rebrand mental health, and yeah, my take on it is form and using the score out of 10 to make it easier for everybody to accept. Yeah, we all exist on that scale, and we all have our mental health. But the cultural and the systemic point you make is really interesting, and I want to explore that a bit further. And Ro, what's your take on this?
And again, look, everything that Abijay and Martika have said, I think cultural and systemic are two really important words there. I think if I speak, and you know, I'm not going to repeat too much of what they've said because I think it's so valuable. I think I was always one of those people who doesn't quite fit in a box. I'm West Indian, and very proudly West Indian, but West Indian of East Indian background and not of African background. So immediately, if you ask me to fill in a D&I box, I'm other. I don't really belong. I'm not a black African, but I am a West Indian. So there was always that tension for me from day one. But the reality is, if we bring it back to thinking about vulnerability from a young age, and sadly, this is a conversation that we know is going on around us right now. But from a young age, I grew up being told that actually, if I was to succeed in life, I was going to have to be 2 or 3 times, mainly 3 times better than any of my white English peers and counterparts. That was from school, through university, through work. If I wanted to make anything in life, I had to be that much better because of the color of my skin. That's a really difficult burden to carry around in your life with you. And actually, as a West Indian who was also a sportsman and male, you bring together all of those stereotypes. I wasn't good at vulnerability. So, you know, for me to have an incapability of speaking about vulnerability, to have an incapability to accept that my mental well-being was challenging me, which meant that I couldn't speak to anyone because of, you know, that whole dynamic brings the cultural and systemic piece into the great difficulty and challenge that particularly men, but women as well from our BAME backgrounds have in speaking about mental well-being. So that's before we even talk about the cultural community opinions, which Abijay has gone into. But actually, when we begin to just look at the difficulties that vulnerability presents because of the systemic challenges for BAME communities, I think, Rob, we begin to you know, see the challenges firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. And Abijay, welcome back. We lost you for a second there. Thank you. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, just those words, you felt you had to be better than a white person to succeed, layering on top of that a mental health challenge, and the way society views a mental health challenge as weakness. then what are you going to do, right? It's an impossible scenario, and vulnerability is the key to receiving that collective support. And yet you there's no way you're going to be vulnerable with those levels on you. And I think, as a white man with bipolar disorder growing up, I just knew, or I had this ingrained belief that I could not talk about my mental illness. I didn't even know I was ill to start with, but even when I did, I thought, you just don't talk about it. But I didn't have that other layer of feeling that actually, even if I am vulnerable, that's going to harm me because of other stuff that's going on. It's fascinating and not in a good way. And I'm ever the optimist. So I'm going to say hopefully that's changing, but we're seeing the response now to a world that has not moved on as it should have done. But we'll come back to that. So everyone, please start filtering through some questions in the Q&A. You're being great on the chat, and keep your comments coming. It's wonderful. We will get to some audience Q&A as we progress through this. Rachel, if I could please turn to you, and again, not a great week for the trans community. Can you talk us through, in case anybody's not aware, but then also, I think, expand on the specific mental health challenges facing the trans and non-binary community, please?
Well, it's funny, I was listening to what Rohan was saying. I mean, when that was really a point that resonated with me about having to work 100 hours a week and be better than everybody else. I mean, in the 90s when I transitioned, a lot of the women in the workplace were saying, wow, glass ceiling, what are you doing? You're giving up your male privilege, which I never really felt that I had. But you're going to be joining a second-class citizenship in this organization. And that was right. I mean, women weren't doing very well in the organization I was, and that did change. But so I worked 100 hours a week and took on jobs that nobody wanted to do. Took on a forlorn hope project management team, as I called it. We did everything that nobody wanted to do. We were trying to be better than everybody else. And that was great. And we achieved so much, but we all had mental health issues because we all were working weekends and on our Blackberries. Remember Blackberries? And working so hard. Bringing that to modern day, I mean, the trans community is, one of the things is actually there's no stigma about mental health in the trans community because we are all very familiar with it in our own community. All that we have a lot of counselling, a lot of psychology, all that kind of stuff, and we all are. I'm very familiar with all counselling and diagnosis and all the other things that we have to go through. But if you look on the forums right now, I mean, that's a lot of the stuff that the community, the non-binary and trans community talk about their mental health status. Sadly, I really like the 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10, actually staying in how I think we should do that. And we are suffering things like getting access to services right now. The mental health services are not great for trans and non-binary, and lockdown, they're even worse. And we've got this social stigma about trans people in the United Kingdom. And this is the biggest challenge for the community right now, in that since about 2015, the UK media has started a really anti-trans and non-binary hate campaign. It's based on a great deal of false evidence. But the trans community doesn't have a voice on these things. We don't have access to the Sunday Times, who spend a lot of time writing things about us. There's a lot of groups who are well organised. They've actually just nudged the government over on their agenda. So we had this big consultation about making our lives easier, called the Gender Recognition Act, and the government looked like they're going to throw that to the wind. Now, if you go on the trans and non-binary forums right now, they're in meltdown. The number of people that are saying they want to leave the UK but can't, they are not sleeping, they are panicking, and I don't blame them. I haven't slept very well over the last 4 nights since I heard the news that the government are going to change our rights. And they're talking about things about, almost taking your passport to use a bathroom. It's kind of these scary tactics we're reading online. I have to prove that I'm a woman before I can go into a toilet. This is this kind of scare stuff that's going all over the web at the moment. And the community is feeling very, very scared right now. It feels, we never thought we would be going backwards. As we watch the UK plunge down the LGBT elite tables, it's becoming very worrying that the trans community is going to get thrown under the bus in the next few months. And that is causing a lot of anguish, including to me. And I transitioned 20 years ago, and I feel more unsafe now than I did 20 years ago. So yeah, it's a big challenge.
Yeah, and I mean, these are tough issues that we're facing and we're grappling with. For me, one theme that I think is coming out of all of us is the ability for us to be vulnerable about our mental health. And whether it's just a general level of stigma, whether it's a systemic issue, whether it's a cultural issue, or how the social stigma that you mentioned there, Rachel. These are all preventing us from being ourselves, and being ourselves then helps us collectively get the help that we need with a mental health challenge. And that's the job, isn't it? It's smashing all of those stigmas and creating environments where, whatever our differences, we feel comfortable speaking about mental health. As I listen to myself, I realize I'm talking too much, and it should be you guys doing the talking, because these are the perspectives we want to hear. I just going off script a little bit, but picking up on the theme of prevention and promote. I don't even like the word prevention, actually. I know what it means, preventing getting ill, but I'd rather talk about promoting positive well-being. And I think I'd be interested in your perspectives on how we can kind of try and tackle some of these issues by focusing on promoting positive mental health and well-being. Abhijay, what's your take on that one?
Yeah, totally agree. I think the narrative needs to change. I mean, if I reflect back to my company's journey in this, we started by providing a lot more support to people who were experiencing mental ill health, and changing the support on that was the first thing. Tick, done, right? Next thing has been a lot about the education and providing people with the knowledge and the tools to be able to talk about mental health. Tick. But for me, the biggest and the biggest bit is how do you tailor and design a program which allows people to be who they are, the best of who they are, whether at work or outside work, so that they are able to bring their whole self, and therefore, never even get into that sort of really, that negative zone where they need sort of clinical intervention. And I've increasingly sort of come to play a single strategy which works. There are multiple strategies for different people, different types of people, different characteristics. And in order to achieve that conversation can't start, at least in the workplace context, can't start with the HR department. It needs to start with the CEO. Yeah. So for me, one of the biggest changes, and Ron, I can see you grinning, because I think I'll be talking about something you violently agree with as well. Is
absolutely
one of the biggest challenges is exactly that. Is how do you make it a conversation with the CEO as opposed to the head of HR? And for me, the one positive I'm hoping which comes out of this pandemic is that, in that CEOs have realized that without a well-being strategy, they will not be able to keep their staff together. And it was interesting. For the first time ever, I saw the government put out a requirement asking employers to have a mental health plan in place as part of the return to work plans. That kind of a narrative shift which is happening, I think that's where I'm pinning a lot of hope on, because then it gets into the day-to-day stuff. I don't think it's a sort of a niche area for the well-being team to deal with. It is everybody's job, senior leadership all the way down.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ro, you were nodding there, and your question was why is it so important to that mental well-being agenda is driven at board level, and Abhijay saying that should rest with the CEO, and I've heard people like John Flint and Sareen Cheshire say the same. Why do you think that's so important, Ro?
I think for me, the biggest influencers within the workplace are our business leaders. They are the ones that they're the ones who drive change. They are the ones who own the budgets practically. They're the ones who drive and own the culture. And what that means is, as an HR director, and I can work with focus groups across the company, I can work with leaders across the company and say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to bring in mental well-being sessions, we're going to have these resources for our people, and we're going to look after the well-being of our people. And it's all empty if C-level do not back that up. If, for example, the first person that comes to me after we've had this great breakout session about mental well-being. Someone comes up to me tomorrow and says, Ro, I'm having a really difficult time here. You know, what can I do? And the first thing our sales director comes up to me and says, oh, we can't have someone who's who's going to have time off work, and so on and so forth. How can it coexist? So from the basic principle of senior business leaders, they have to deliver this strategy and do it through people on the ground. But if they do not actually really drive it, we've got no chance, mate.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree, and Sarah Restall, I'm sure, will chime in the comments about the work we're doing on the Inside Out Charter, where one of the key principles of that charter is having a board level sponsor. It's so important, isn't it?
And actually, for me, that was part of the reason why I really wanted to be part of Inside Out, because it's a privilege and actually something I'm very proud of, to be part of a group of business of people at leadership level who are committed to driving that change. The one thing I'd say is actually semantics as well is so important. Within the workplace, it's so important that we do drive the well-being agenda, and that we make sure that people understand what the difference is between driving better well-being and actually clinical mental illness.
Yeah.
Two different things. Driving mental well-being isn't going to eradicate clinical mental illness. No more than me going out for a run tonight will stop me from getting a serious illness at some point in my life. However, when it comes to mental health, we don't seem societally to have created an awareness around the difference in language. So the way that we frame it, the way that we get our semantics is so important.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's another big stigma to break, is getting people to think, look, we all have well-being, and that's a positive thing, like our physical fitness, and we can all influence that. And we do that, we can move up that productivity curve. Martika, I'm going to come to you in a second, and I'm keen to understand about the kind of.
Sorry, Rob, just to chime in, that link to productivity is where I see a real angle and a real interest of translating it for the C-suite. Of if you can sit there and say, well-being equals productivity equals profit, that I think suddenly shifts the language in a very different way. And something I'm very curious to sort of explore.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic should provide more of an impetus to do that, because we are going to need to focus on both the well-being from a moral point of view, but the productivity of our workers. Martika, I'm going to come to you in a second and ask you just around the preventional promotion type solutions, how we make them more accessible to the BAME communities. Rachel, you have operated at a senior level in organisations and are exposed to a senior level. Do you feel that we will be able to engage leadership more strongly, both on the mental health agenda but also the trans agenda, given what's going on at the moment?
Well, I mean, every organisation and culture is different. One of the things that we do with Global Butterflies is that we don't tend to work with organisations, and I have that luxury, luckily, of working with organisations where we don't have senior leadership buy-in, because we can't do the job that we need to do to go in there. So getting that light shining down on the process, so that we can then put in procedures for fair recruitment for trans and non-binary people, looking after them through the process, getting their first appointment, making sure they're looked after and their welfare in the place, and also that the healthcare is there, and their employee assistance program supports trans and non-binary health. So we put all those things in. We can't do that. I mean, the ally networks are really powerful, and we use those, and the LGBT networks are very powerful, but they don't often have the power to make those things happen. And organizations some of them often say, we don't have any trans or non-binary people in our organization, which they almost certainly do. And what signals are you sending into the workplace? You've had a trans panel, you've had a trans speaker. That's a tick boxing exercise. Those things are important, but it's only one step of the journey. And people in your organization can see your authenticity on this. And also employees people outside applying into your workplace are looking at what I call your trans brand, your social media, the way you write your adverts, the things that appear in your marketing. They can stand in a reception before they apply and see if they see lanyards or gender neutral clothing, anything that your brand is sending. So even if you're thinking you're being authentic and you're not truly doing so, people can see and feel that. So it does feel that, if your senior leader or the board is not behind that, well, your initiative is never going to really succeed. And we're really passionate at GB. We try to get what we call these closed door sessions where we lock ourselves away with the senior leadership. It's closed door, nothing leaves the room. And we have it out about why recruiting LGBT plus employees are positive for the brand. Having a diverse workforce right across the spectrum is going to make your whole workforce happy. It's going to be good for your bottom line. It's going to be better for your R&D, and you should be doing it. And it gets quite heated sometimes, but we love those sessions. But that's why nothing leaves the room, because it gets fiery. But yeah, it's the most, as everybody said, it's the most essential thing. If you don't have the senior leadership, it's just going to fail.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we can all agree on that. So Martika, just looking a bit more deeply into the prevention promotion and how we make that more accessible to BAME communities. What are your thoughts on that?
Just to link really to kind of what's been said, I think we have to move from transactional into transformational. And I think what happens a lot at the moment is we have these transactional interactions in organizations, and so it's like a one-off workshop, or to train employees or managers to be mental health first aid trained, and this stuff's great, but I think we need to move beyond that now and into this transformational process where actually this stuff is really embedded in culture. It means that, instead of having these conversations, actually the diversity of the board encompasses all of these voices. That's transformational. So I'm really interested in the kind of preventative mental health space, and I know that you don't like that word, Rob.
Everybody uses it. It's fine. I get it.
What else to call it? Maybe mental fitness. But I think there's real room in the mental fitness conversation. When we're looking at sleep, relationships, connection, belonging, all of these things that we can actually really culturally nuance and really connect and find meaning from our own voices, whatever that looks like. So, I agree with what Abji said at the beginning around, there's not a one size fits all. We can't have one strategy, one work plan. It needs to be really, really diverse. And what that looks like for me is certainly around kind of what is it employees are saying? How often do we ask them? What we want, what they want, sorry. And I think the other potential challenge with this and opportunity, if we're going from an employee engagement perspective, is actually, the stats tell us people don't like talking about their mental health or mental illness at work. 11% of, I think the figure's around 11% of people that tell their manager, if they're really suffering with a mental health issue. So how do we take that away from the workplace in the sense of it can still be accessed or connected with the workplace, but it's not delivered by the workplace? So I think there's something about separation maybe, or boundaries around that, so people feel safe, because I think to really tap into early help, we have to feel safe, and we have to feel that we belong and that we're being heard. So I think there's really opportunity in the workplace to start to have these conversations, but not necessarily owned by the organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm hearing the word safety there, and I think all organisations are going to need to focus on psychological safety as a result of Corona and coming out of lockdown and back into the physical space. And that's got to be an opportunity to make people feel more inclusive and safe if we do it right. So I've got one more question. If there are any questions from the audience, please post in the Q&A. We've got a few minutes left. Just quickly round the room. I'm getting a bit of an echo. Sorry. A bit quickly around there. What is your hope coming out of the pandemic for the mental health agenda, and specifically for any of the diverse communities that you would feel part of? Abhijay.
I think just building on the points we were making earlier, this needs to be built into the fabric of the organization. And maybe it's the accountant in me which is going to say this, but it needs to be measured. It needs to be measured, and therefore it is built into scorecards and performance reports and everything else that big organizations thrive on. So for me, the lasting impact that I'd like to see on.
Measurement. Interesting. That's a good one. Martika?
I think that, I mean, the pandemic's obviously thrown up so many things, and I think it's a real prime time now while we are reviewing business processes actually, and because of social distancing, because of remote working. I think there's a real opportunity for your organisations to understand what do flourishing and thriving organisations look like. And I think that's the language that we need to think about: resilience, flourishing, thriving, because I think there's a real opportunity to build this in, as well as diversity, into the kind of the fabric, that transformational piece again, of how back from this. So I've been using something called Lego Serious Play and building these interesting little things to help organisations think about actually, you know, what do they want a thriving, flourishing organisation to look like? How can we make this part of, you know, coming out of the pandemic so it's part of the structure and not an add-on? I mean, what Abjay was saying about, you know, the return on investment and measurements, I think there's a real opportunity now to be able to do that with the coronavirus. And actually, you know, how do people feel? Like, you know, implementing your scorecards and measuring it that way is a really good way of being able to measure it. But I agree with you, Rob. I think that it has to be moral as well as productivity and financial based, because actually, if we have happy, healthy employees, they are much more productive. That's the reality.
Agreed. Thank you, Martika. And Ro, a double quick question for you, actually, as to what is your hope coming out of the pandemic, but a question from Laura. As a first step to bring this agenda to a company who's never tackled it, what would you recommend? So I'm going to just ask you a quick fire answer both, if you can.
I think the first question in response to Laura would absolutely be to actually share stories. It's so important that we share stories, and they don't have to be successful stories. Obviously, successful stories bring hope. And by actually, successful is the wrong word. They don't have to be miracle stories. So, okay, let me be quite honest. I've got a miracle story. I was 5 minutes from death after a suicide attempt. However, not every story is like that. There are so many people who can share stories of overcoming challenge, overcoming difficulties in their lives, begin to share them in the workplace, and actually bring leaders into that forum so they can see the impact. So you're sharing leadership and vulnerability, and that's going to be a very powerful force for change. That's for you, Laura. I think, Rob, in terms of moving forward, I think sustainable, affordable. We need to have sustainable solutions in the workplace, but they need to be affordable solutions, because there's so many startups coming into the world who want to have mental health solutions for companies, but COVID is going to impact on budgets, on economies, so we need to self-serve this.
Yep. Absolutely agree with that. And then Rachel, if I could ask you again, what is your hope? And hope's a lovely word with all of this, isn't it? We all need to have hope coming out of the pandemic.
I really agree with you. With your care of LGBT plus employees, it's got to be in your DNA of your firm. It's got to be built right through your healthcare, your mental health, first aiders, your health schemes, your training. Right across. It has to be pervasive, not bolt on. My hope is that for trans and non-binary in particular, they've been locked up with family that haven't been that great. They have not had access to their medical services. I know companies are going to be concentrating on closing buildings, merging up buildings, splitting the workforce in and out, cleaning, all that stuff. But remember to sit down with your trans and non-binary employees when they return and say, is there anything that we can be doing for you right now? Because for some of us, sometimes the workplace is the only place where it's been great for us. Outside hasn't been good. So make sure you have those conversations. Say, are you okay? Is there anything you need? Sometimes they'll have debts and things. Maybe you should pay those debts and set up a payment scheme for them, but look after them when they return to the workplace, because they'll look after you. They'll be great employees.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, that brings us to time, and I know some of you got to jump. So it leaves for me just to sum up briefly. That was a really rich and fantastic discussion. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. I've heard a lot about recovery. I've heard a lot about of measuring and finding ways to include different groups in the discussion. I've heard that we need leadership engagement, which clearly we're all very passionate about, and I've heard a strong message of hope and positivity, even though that we're facing difficult challenges in many different ways on a global basis. But it is human beings like you that will help make the change. So I want to thank all of you for giving up your time, but also for everything you do. I'm sure we'll see some love on the chat as well. The platform will be open now for another 30 minutes to continue the discussions at the tables. And just leaves me to say thank you very much, everyone.